Right, we'll get going here. So, hi everyone. I'm Margot Conahan, ACRL's Manager of Professional Development. Thank you for joining us for today's ACRL Student Learning and Information Literacy Professional Development Committee webinar, Universal Design for Learning and Information Literacy. I just wanted to share a few housekeeping notes before we get started. As you just heard, the session today is being recorded. We'll share out the link to the recording and the PowerPoint slides shortly after the event today, so please watch your email for that. You can use chat to comment throughout the session today, and then there's the Q&A pod where you can enter your questions. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so please go ahead and use the chat and Q&A pod throughout. And then closed captioning is available today. You should see a show captions button at the bottom of the Zoom ribbon if you need to enable captions. So just want to let you know that's available. And now I will turn things over to our moderator with the fantastic wallpaper, Lindsay Matz-Pittenson, to kick us off.
Hello and good afternoon or morning, depending on what time of day you are at. My name is Lindsay Matz-Pittenson. I use she, her pronouns. I lead the teaching and learning program at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And I am so excited to welcome our wonderful panelists today on behalf of the Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee. Our committee gets to do a couple webinars every year, and we want to do timely topics, things that we know are important to our instruction practice and just the things that we do to enhance student learning. So I was really excited when the committee came up with this as one of our priority panels. So I want to introduce our three panelists for the day. We have Christina Clement, who is the Outreach Librarian and Assistant Professor of Library Science at, I'm gonna butcher it because I'm from Minnesota, and Kenesaw State University. We're just gonna let her pronounce that later because gotta throw in my Midwest terrible pronunciation. Dr. Carrie Weaver, the Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo, and Meredith Saba, the Head of Access Research and Instructional Services at Western Carolina University. And so I am going to hand this. This is the last you'll hear from me for a while, but again, like Margot said, put your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to all of those at the end. Otherwise, let us know in chat if you have any questions, and I'm going to hand it over to Christina.
All right, thanks, Lindsay. Let me get my slides up. All right, that look good? Yep. All right. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this panel on Universal Design for Learning and Information Literacy. I'm up first with my portion of the panel, which I have titled Intentionally Equitable, UDL and Information Literacy Outreach. So we have some presentation materials to share with you all, and these are for all three of the panelists today, for myself, Carrie, and Meredith. There's a link to a Google Drive folder on this slide. It is also in the chat now, and you can also scan that QR code. The QR code will pop up on a few more of my slides if you miss it, and I'm happy to pop that link in the chat at any time. So in the Google Drive folder, you can find all three of our slide decks, so if you want to follow along, you're welcome to. And then we've each popped in a few additional resources for further reading if you're interested. All right, so hi, I'm Christina Clement, and I am the Outreach Librarian for the Academic Engagement and Instruction Unit at the Kennesaw State University Libraries. And I have been incorporating UDL into my information literacy pedagogy and my practice of librarianship for about the last 6 years. And I really enjoy finding new ways to apply the framework to different aspects of what I do. So today I'm going to cover three things. So first, I'm going to give a brief introduction to Universal Design for Learning on behalf of the whole panel, so you don't get that intro 3 times. And then I'm going to talk about applying UDL to information literacy outreach, something that I've been working on for about the last 2 to 3 years. And interwoven with that, I'll give you some examples of UDL in different information literacy outreach scenarios. So before we really dive into the specifics of the UDL guidelines, I think it's useful to take a quick look at the progression from universal design to universal design for learning. So Universal Design for Learning, UDL, which we'll say pretty frequently as the abbreviation, was more or less born out of the concept of universal design. So universal design came to us from Ronald Mace, an architect, in the late 1980s. And he described universal design as the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or special design. So universal design traditionally focuses more or less on tangible objects, environments, and products, and it's been a staple of user-centered design for decades. Over the years, we started to see a shift in universal design from products and environments to education and specifically pedagogy. So a desire to apply universal design to pedagogy resulted in the creation of Universal Design for Learning from the Center for Applied Special Technology, which now they just call themselves the abbreviation CAST, C-A-S-T. They developed this to meet these new needs. And although Universal Design and Universal Design for Learning were kind of developing along the same timelines, the definition of universal design came first and really gave way for UDL to find its footing and solidification with the UDL guidelines that we're most used to at present, which took shape in the early 2010s. So if you're really interested in the full timeline of development, there is a link on this slide. And in the resources portion of the Google Drive folder to the CAST website, they have a really beautiful timeline of innovation. It's quite impressive to read through it all. But at its core, UDL is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insight into how humans learn. So we've really moved from designing inclusive products to designing inclusive pedagogy to designing to be inclusive to people in all aspects of their educational experience. So let's go over just quickly what UDL is. So UDL is a pedagogical framework developed by CAST that has developed a set of principles for curriculum development that works to promote equitable learning for all. UDL helps instructors design learning environments that account for individual variability so that all learners have the option and the flexibility to take control over how they learn to optimize their experience. UDL has a really strong foundation in research and is based on a foundational set of more than 800 peer-reviewed research articles. And it provides a series of benchmarks and checkpoints for educators to help them implement the framework into their curriculum. And at its core, it works to minimize some of the barriers that are inherent to education while increasing opportunities to learn. And this explanation of UDL comes from the websites that are linked on the page. And again, these are also in the Google Drive folder under resources under my section. But I drew pretty heavily from the UDL on Campus site, which is a really fantastic resource that I really recommend that you check out. There's some really well thought out examples that are higher education specific that I think for us as librarians are really useful because they feel a little more translatable to the library work that we do than a lot of what's on sort of the general CAST website. So this graphic here is the most basic representation of the UDL guidelines. As I mentioned, the concept and practice of UDL were developing around the same time as the concept of universal design, but the first version of the UDL guidelines didn't appear until 2008. And they've gone through a few updates in the last 10 years or so. And the current version can be found on CAST website. And a little bit later, Carrie's going to tell us, give us maybe a little sneak peek about the next version of the UDL guidelines, which I believe are scheduled to release later this year. But since those are not available publicly yet, we're going to focus on the set of guidelines that we have available to us, which is what you'll find if you go to CAST website right now. So the guidelines consist of 3 core principles for multiple means of engagement. So the why of learning, representation, the what of learning, and action and expression, the how of learning. What I think is great about the UDL framework is that it can be applied to any discipline, including librarianship and information literacy, either instruction or outreach, basically everything that we do. We've included some worksheets from CAST in the Google Drive folder that I used in the very beginning to help make all of this feel a little more manageable. Because if you've never seen the big chart before, which we're going to look at on the next slide, the content can be a little overwhelming at first. And then I also want to point out that in the resources section of the Google Drive folder, I've included 2 sets of translation tables. So the first set of translation tables help you interpret the UDL guidelines for information literacy instruction, so something that's classroom-based. And these I co-created with a former colleague from the University of Wyoming, Samantha Peter. The second set of translation tables helps you envision the UDL guidelines for outreach efforts. And I created these based on the ones I made with Samantha as part of a forthcoming article that should be out this summer in the Journal of Library Outreach and Engagement. So if you're interested in seeing a bunch of examples of how to apply the UDL guidelines to instruction and outreach aspects of librarianship, you can take a look at those, and you're welcome to download copies as you wish. So these are the UDL guidelines. If you know anything about UDL, or if you've attended any kind of workshop, webinar, or professional development related to UDL, you've probably seen this table. It's a lot of info. So UDL is all about designing educational experiences for learners that meet the needs of trying to get everyone all at once. And that sounds really overwhelming because it is. So I think you could spend your whole career, you could do several postgraduate degrees exploring applications of UDL in the classroom and how that relates to information literacy, instruction, and outreach. But the good news is that you can spend as much or as little time with these guidelines as you want. So if you're interested in incorporating UDL into your information literacy pedagogy or information literacy outreach, all it can really take is one small change to make a big impact on the students that we serve. And then once you take that first small step, you could choose to take another and another and another. And really you can do as many or as few as you want. And what I really like about the UDL guidelines is the framing around multiple means. So each of the 3 principles starts with provide multiple means of. And that phrasing resonates with me because it does remind me that I get to structure the different ways in how students are going to interact with information literacy. And then the students get to make a choice about how they want to learn what I am there to teach. And I think that's really nice. So why is this important for information literacy efforts, and why should we use UDL as librarians? First and foremost, UDL helps students with disabilities. Students don't always ask for the accommodations that they need. Sometimes they don't even know that they need accommodations, whether they have a disability or not. So using UDL to teach and promote information literacy can mitigate the need for some accommodations by providing these flexible learning experiences from the beginning. UDL also promotes more equitable library instruction. So the one-shot instruction session is really common in our work. And I'm a big believer that the one-shot positions students in a classroom of equality where they all get the same tools, they all get the same instruction, and the same time to absorb and digest the information that we're presenting. An equal classroom assumes that all students learn the same and that sameness is where it's at. So bringing UDL into your information literacy pedagogy creates a pathway to let students choose how they learn, which I believe promotes a classroom of equity, where students are presented with a variety of tools and they take what they need at the time. So an equitable classroom assumes nothing about the students, but rather uses the flexible learning to reach as many people as possible. And in turn, this lowers the barriers to information and can start to decrease some of the power structures that we frequently see. So because UDL is designed with the classroom in mind, it can be a little tricky to try and envision the UDL guidelines as applicable to other aspects of librarianship and how we teach information literacy. But it's not impossible. I think you just have to get a little creative and allow yourself to think outside the box. So there are many ways to apply each of the 3 principles to information literacy outreach in particular. And I think when we design our information literacy outreach with the UDL guidelines in mind, we instantly make our outreach efforts more equitable and user-friendly. Yeah, it's probably going to take a little more work in the beginning, but I think it's really worth it in the end. Plus, I kind of view UDL a little bit like muscle memory. The more you get used to it and the more you incorporate it into your practices, the easier it becomes. And eventually, some things are just second nature. So the UDL framework is meant to be a pick and choose model where practitioners can decide for themselves which elements make the most sense to implement. So some guidelines might be especially relevant for certain outreach activities and not for others. So my advice is to choose wisely and start making your outreach more accessible to all by taking the small steps that have potential for big impact. We're going to take a look at one example of information literacy outreach from each of these three principles. So multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. So first, we're going to look at the principle of multiple means of engagement and specifically the guideline of options for recruiting interest, checkpoint 7.1, optimize individual choice and autonomy. And you can see it highlighted there in the red square. So multiple means of engagement focuses on the different ways in which people are motivated to learn, which in turn influences why they engage with content, experiences, people, and resources. So this principle, its guidelines and checkpoint, encourages librarians to consider multiple ways to engage users in outreach activities, events, and programs by providing multiple options, because there's no one means of engagement that's going to motivate everyone. So we're going to look closely at the guideline of options for recruiting interest. Again, checkpoint 7.1, optimize individual choice and autonomy. So the checkpoint is defined as providing options for various things, such as level of perceived challenge, the tools used for information gathering, and learning objects. So if we were to translate this into a librarianship context and specifically an information literacy outreach context, it's relatively simple and it's probably something that you already do. What you could do is you would give users options of how they're going to interact with your outreach efforts. So this could come in the form of handouts, maybe a QR code to link to digital copies of handouts, or even just a simple verbal explanation of services, resources, and how to find information at the library. It can also take the form of a space where users can independently collect information without having to speak to anyone. So my example of this in action is the KSU Library's annual Bash in the Stacks event, which is a welcome event at the beginning of each fall semester. So the event presents mostly as fun because we got to get the students there somehow, but it's actually really informational. And we managed to convey a lot of information about the library to students during this event. So students attend for like the oversized yard games that we have and our library therapy corgi dog. Yes, we have one of those. She's awesome. But while they're at the event, they are encouraged to collect these custom bookmarks that we make that serve as a QR code link to the services we need them to know about. So students do have to talk to a librarian to get their bookmark, and that conversation really serves as an opportunity for the librarian to showcase our resources and connect with students. So the event itself encompasses quite a few of the UDL guidelines, but it specifically does meet checkpoint 7.1 here by providing many options for students to engage, information gather, and collect the learning objects. Next, we are going to look at the principle of multiple means of representation and specifically the guideline of options for comprehension, checkpoint 3.3, guide information processing and visualization. And you can see it highlighted there in the red square. So users, regardless of whether or not they need accommodations in their academic efforts, they approach, perceive, and comprehend information in different ways that help them better understand what they're learning. So there are many different ways that users might need to approach content provided through outreach events, programs, or engagements. And multiple means of representation encourages librarians to consider a multitude of ways to present outreach content and provide multiple options for the representation of information. So we'll look closely at the guideline of options for comprehension, as I mentioned, checkpoint 3.3, guide information processing and visualization. And this checkpoint is designed as using well-designed materials to help students process the content. So if we were to translate this into a librarianship context and specifically an information literacy outreach context, say maybe a workshop or an event that might require directions, you want to give explicit instructions, probably both verbally and written, and or you could diagram out the steps visually. So this works well when you have an outreach event or program where users need to move through it in a specific way. Using multiple representations of the directions allows users to process what you're asking them to do in ways that work for them. So my example for this is the writing sprint that the KSU libraries host in conjunction with our Writing Center. The event allows us to provide both of our services, so library research consultations and Writing Center consultations, at the same time in the same space. We are constantly referring students to the other service, and so is the Writing Center. So a few times a year, we partner to provide all of these services in one location. And to make sure that the event flows smoothly and that we have adequate tracking and assessment of the students who attend the event, there's a very specific procedure that needs to be followed when students arrive. So students basically get 3 choices when they show up to the event. They can meet with a librarian to work on research. They can meet with a writing assistant to get help with a draft or citations, or they can find a place to work and use one or both of these services later. And there's no limit on how many times they can meet with a librarian or a Writing Center person. Now, granted, students can do all of these things while they're there, but we need to help them figure out what might be best for them to do first. Because if they've already done their research and they have a draft, they might just need the Writing Center. But if they don't even have a draft yet, talking to someone from the Writing Center isn't going to do much good when they actually need to do some research first. So to do this, we have the student fill out an intake form. It helps them self-select an option to start with. So the form explains their choices. The event staffer who receives that intake form back also explains their choices to them verbally and uses the information that they filled out to help them make the best choice. And then we also have a slide deck on a loop on the classroom projectors that continually explains the options, both textually and visually, so that students are reminded that they can do multiple things at the event. And then all librarians and Writing Center assistants who are working at the event are trained to explain the flow of the event to any student that they meet with. So this event gave all participants options for comprehension to help guide information processing and visualization by providing everyone with multiple ways to understand the intent and the flow. And this event in particular intentionally used UDL as a means of helping students and staff understand the event. So this was a pretty effective way to incorporate UDL into an outreach activity that allowed for multiple means of representation. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So last, we are going to look at the principle of multiple means of action and expression, and specifically the guideline of options for executive functions, checkpoint 6.1, guide appropriate goal setting, which you can see highlighted in the red square. So how users navigate learning environments is going to vary from person to person, and it's important to take into consideration the physicality of outreach events, and activities and programs, because individuals with movement impairments, whether they're visible or not, may need to or prefer to approach your programming in different ways. So this principle, its guidelines and checkpoints, encourages librarians to consider all types of abilities, not just movement, but also maybe verbal and abilities that may deal with executive functions when designing outreach, because there's not one means of action and expression that's going to work for all learners. So, all right, we're going to look closely at the guideline of options for executive functions. Again, checkpoint 6.1, guide appropriate goal setting. This checkpoint is defined as letting students practice setting challenging and authentic goals. So I do want to briefly note, sometimes I found if you want to apply a UDL guideline to outreach, you have to think a little bit more about how it applies to you and your work rather than the students you're doing outreach to. So in this case, if we were to translate this into a librarianship context and specifically an information literacy outreach context, you might need to think about how the goals you set for yourself in the event can be appropriate and scale up. And I think if done well, it's going to allow users to select what they want to accomplish at the event without them even knowing they're selecting something. So my example for this is the Pi a Librarian event that we did in spring 2023. So it was an outreach event that was held on March 14th, commonly known as Pi Day, because it's 314, 3.14. And we took it as an opportunity to survey students and learn more about what they knew about the library, while allowing them to very joyously pie a librarian in the face with a whipped cream pie. And it was as awesome as it sounds. It was really fun. So my outreach team and I, we set 3 goals for the event that were both participant focused and us focused, and that scaled up in terms of engagement, but all were valuable to our overall goal of learning about student knowledge of the library, educating students further about the library, and just raising general awareness. So the lowest level goal was that students would hang out and watch librarians get pied. Really basic, simple. The middle goal was that students would take our survey and then they would get to choose either to have like a little mini pie as a reward that they could eat, or the chance to pie a librarian. And then the high level goal was that students would talk to us and each other about the library during the event, while also hopefully accomplishing the low and middle level goals. So we didn't share these goals with the participants. They were only shared with the outreach team and anyone else from the library who volunteered. And not sharing the goals of the event with the participants allowed them to choose how they wanted to participate. So by providing options for executive functions and guiding appropriate goal setting for the event, students were allowed to self-select how they were going to interact and how they would express themselves based on, what they wanted to do. So this was a pretty effective way to intentionally incorporate UDL into an outreach activity that allows for multiple means of action and expression. So this is just a really short snippet of how to apply UDL to information literacy outreach, or really any kind of library outreach. And the best advice I have for you about starting to or even continuing to incorporate UDL into any practice of librarianship is to start slow. When I started infusing UDL into my sessions and outreach efforts, I did it one element at a time. I tried one thing over and over and I got really comfortable with it. And tried to make it a really natural part of how I taught or designed outreach. And once I mastered that, I tried incorporating another, then another, and another, and it just snowballed from there. So UDL isn't really the end all for equitable information literacy instruction and outreach. I think it's merely one tool amongst many that we can use to practice what we preach and move our profession into the future. And that future, I think, is bright. I think there's a lot more work to be done to intentionally apply equitable practices to information literacy instruction and outreach, but I have no doubt that we can get there. So these are some links and resources, some further reading, some of the work that I've done on UDL, plus the different links to CAST. These are all in the Google Drive folder, which I'll pop that link in the chat again once I finish. But thank you so much. And of course, we'll answer questions after all 3 panelists have finished. But please feel free to email me after the fact. I could probably talk about these things all day long. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. We're going to go on to our next panelist with Dr. Carrie Weaver.
I can manage to unmute myself. So thank you so much, Christina, both for that presentation and also for being willing to give us an overview. In the time that I have today, I am going to focus on the sort of intersections, alignments, and tensions between UDL and digital accessibility as it applies to online learning, but also your information literacy practice as you might experience it in the classroom. So I am Dr. Carrie Weaver. I'm the Learning, Teaching, and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And that context is really important, as you will learn, because part of the reason I'm focused on digital accessibility and considering how it works with UDL is because of my positioning in the province of Ontario, which is in the process of adopting some of the most comprehensive accessibility legislation and criteria in the world right now. So in addition to my practice as a librarian, I also teach as an adjunct faculty member at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, where the courses I teach focus on educational research methods and also the practice of teaching and learning in higher education spaces. So that's a little about me. I do also just want to acknowledge that my work and what I will be talking about today really takes place on the lands of the Haldeman Treaty of 1784, land that was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River. And I mention this because reconciliation, truth and reconciliation is particularly important in the Canadian context, but also because, as Christina mentioned, UDL is really originally coming from that architecture or universal design within physical spaces. And so even though a lot of us are really focused on the way that we are sort of applying this in our various contexts, I would encourage you to think about the fact that Indigenous knowledge and traditions probably can have a fairly strong alignment with UDL practices and approaches, given that they're both coming from that context of being rooted in a particular place and space. So while that isn't the focus of what I'm doing today, I think that that's another way to draw connections in how we can use UDL principles and practices to help align what we're doing with inclusive and critical pedagogies in information literacy. So with that, I'll get into what I'm really going to focus on today, which is that alignment in digital accessibility and UDL, and particularly the implications for practice within academic libraries. And I will be sharing some examples from practice within my own institution. I'm also just sharing in the chat a link to our online learning object repository, where I and my team make a lot of our openly published online learning objects available to everyone who would like to use them. To situate ourselves in the discussion of UDL and digital accessibility. So the CAST guidelines that we have just heard about are currently under revision, and the revisions aren't super substantial. The couple of things that are changing or look like they're changing fairly dramatically is a recognition from CAST that there's kind of a continuum between the extent to which the CAST guidelines really provide access and the extent to which they involve learner or perpetuate learner agency. And so they're working on sort of reorganizing a lot of the guidelines to sort of fit along that continuum. And that idea of learner agency is particularly interesting in seeing them incorporate it into the CAST guidelines, because that concept of learner agency really comes out of adult educational theory, andragogy, which recognizes that learners tend to be more intrinsically motivated and see a strong relationship between their learning and a particular social dimension of who they are. So as a student, as a person, as a worker, or they're learning things focused on a particular task. And it's also pretty important because that movement toward learner agency really helps realign a lot of what is happening with CAST toward anti-oppressive pedagogies. And we're often calling that critical information literacy pedagogy within our field. The other thing that they're pretty firmly making some changes to are the overall goals of learning within those three areas of focus. So they're changing those up a little bit, and it looks like they're moving toward the goal of learning being purposeful, motivated, and reflective, authentic, resourceful, and knowledgeable, and strategic, creative, and liberatory, which again is really moving in that direction of kind of inclusive or critical pedagogy. So I think that is important to know that CAST is under revision right now. And while those sort of three big buckets are not going to change, some of the specifics and the way that they're thinking about learning and the focus of instruction are really moving to more intentionally incorporate inclusivity in the instruction. So that brings us to an interesting place with digital accessibility, because digital accessibility, which is a movement that's kind of been happening in parallel in learning spaces, has really been receiving a lot of increasing international focus. And most digital accessibility will refer to the WCAG standards, which are International Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or standards. And there are various versions of WCAG. Version 3.0 has recently been released within the past couple of years. A lot of international accessibility legislation refers to version 2.1, which is the prior version, and requires that people meet a certain level of accessibility standard within online materials, which includes typically instructional materials. And this is interesting. The version 3.0 movement is interesting because it is also actually intentionally moving international accessibility standards toward more inclusive language practices, design. And all of this is really under heavy consideration in my context, because accessibility legislation in Canada is done on a province by province basis. So this would be like if New York State or California just decided they were going to go out on their own and require certain accessibility compliance and legislation. And they might very well do that. You never know. But in Canada, that sort of work is handled provincially. And Ontario has been intentionally since 2015 working on comprehensive accessibility legislation with the intention that all facets of people's interactions with businesses, government, and educational systems in the province of Ontario would be as fully accessible as possible by January 1st, 2025. So any of you keeping track, that's in about 7 months. And that's putting a lot of pressure on lots of organizations in the province of Ontario, but particularly institutions of higher education, because in January, we are expecting to have to comply with a new set of 185 accessibility criteria that have to do with the operation and the instructional delivery within a higher education context. And so that is really interesting. And what is particularly extra interesting about that is the changes that are being recommended in those 185 recommendations, that the ones that actually relate to instructional delivery are really looking to align the instructional practice with a lot of the UDL principles. So there's even though they're not the same thing, there's a strong affinity and relationship between these things. This is also important for those of you who are practicing in the United States, which is probably most people attending this webinar, because Americans with Disabilities Act criteria and also Section 508 legislation is currently under review in the United States. And these look like they are going in the direction that Ontario and some other jurisdictions who are currently sort of at the forefront of digital accessibility work and accessibility in instruction are going. So it is entirely possible that a lot of the things that we are going through in this context will be coming to an institution of higher education near you very soon, and therefore your academic library. And when I say very soon, we all know things move slowly in these realms, but getting a ship to turn in academic libraries can always take some time. All right. So now we are situated. We know that the CAST recommendations are under review. We know that accessibility legislation is changing, and we know that these two things were aligned with one another, but that they are becoming more closely integrated as things develop. So how are they actually aligned among those sort of three big buckets of UDL? So there are a few alignments of engagement between what we're seeing in digital accessibility and UDL guidelines and standards, including things like allowing learners a certain amount of choice and control, being really explicit about the goals and objectives of your instruction up front, easily available help and support, and avoiding harms or distractions. And this is where, when you hear like avoiding harms or distractions, well, this is where applying digital accessibility standards can give you some very practical ways in which to avoid harms or biases within the instruction that you're doing. So what might this look like? Well, when it comes to actually applying this within learning contexts in libraries, actually outlining your learning objectives or goals, laying them out, put them on the slides like Christina and I did in our presentations. If you're doing asynchronous instruction, I have this example here on the screen from some modular asynchronous learning that my team produced at my library. And we literally have the learning goals in this module. We will cover the reasons we need to assess information, what things to look for when assessing information, vertical versus lateral reading, frameworks for assessing academic or scholarly information, frameworks for assessing non-scholarly information, and assessing information provided by Gen AI tools like ChatGPT. So we've been very clear and particular about what we are intending to cover, and we have outlined those upfront in the welcome section. If you're in a situation where you are doing assessments, offer alternative options. In my course, when I'm teaching at the University of Toronto, I intentionally, as a UDL practice, say, this is designed as a written assignment. If you would like to turn it in another format, please let me know so that we can make appropriate arrangements to ensure seamless submission. All thoughts are welcome. And so I'm able to offer students alternative ways to represent that they have met the learning goals through doing that. In asynchronous learning, which a lot of us are very engaged in library land. Branching can be really important to offer learner choice. So we can go this way or this way. In the context of this example, there's actually the structure over on the left-hand side, the left-hand navigation bar. So a learner doesn't have to go through the elements of this modular learning in sequential order. They can say, ooh, I actually just want to learn about evaluating research online, and select that and go through those materials. So looking at the tools and technologies that you're using to ensure that you can offer some level of choice. So when we look at representation, this is where we get into some really intensive alignments between the digital accessibility WCAG guidelines and UDL. Alternative formats, particularly for audio and visual information. This isn't to say that you can't use audio or visual, you absolutely can. And in fact, it's really useful, but multiple means. If you're going to provide visual, it's helpful also to provide audio if you can do that. Clear or simple language or explanation is really held in common with both of these, and also using inclusive language, images, and examples, and being really intentional about that. The other thing that is really important that I think we don't talk enough about in information literacy instruction context is the importance of feedback. And when we're talking about feedback, we really mean what we call an education formative feedback. So it lets you know if you've made a mistake, it lets you know a correct answer. It gives you an understanding if you're really gaining that concept or not. And that's something that I think we can do intentionally in in-person instructional contexts, but also makes a big difference in online learning as well. So if we look at, here is an example of a different course. This is an ongoing course that we had produced looking at academic integrity in STEM disciplines for undergraduate students. So we have check your knowledge questions. And when you actually go to do the check your knowledge, if you don't get the correct answer, it will give you the feedback of what the correct answer is. It will tell you what you scored. And also in those modules, we custom designed and workshopped with a lot of undergraduate students, a lot of custom designed avatars, providing different representation that was meant to be in alignment with our student body. Was actually a lot more inclusive than our faculty and staff, but that's a side point and fairly common in institutions of higher education. So these are things that you can intentionally integrate that align with multiple means of representation, but also really honestly align with good digital accessibility practice. And then we have alignments of action and expression. So there's also some really strong alignment here where you're supposed to optimize materials for use with assistive technologies, which is a lot of what digital accessibility is about. Testing and anticipating challenges. So one of the things that I will say we do within my context is we provide keyboard instructions for all of our online learning. And we will actually go through and test the keyboard navigation for every single thing that we publish on that online learning object repository, because that is important for UDL and for digital accessibility. The varied formats is important, and the navigation options that are clear and really at the forefront are quite important. So this is not sort of like as we're going through, we get to a point, it's like, oh, I want to go on to the next thing. What do I do? It should be really clear that it says something like continue to the next lesson. So these are things that are all in alignment between digital accessibility and UDL. So in practice, it could look something like this. So this is a screenshot that shows an interactive activity where a student is going through some decision making around whether or not they're going to use generative artificial intelligence. We have audio in addition to the text, and the learner is making intentional choices about whether or not they're going to use or not use ChatGPT. We can provide alt text for images. We want to check and test the navigation of these things to ensure that they're in alignment. So that's great. There are, however, some tensions between UDL and digital accessibility. Digital accessibility is really looking for a lot clearer structure and consistency than UDL necessarily cares about. And UDL is a lot more interested in the affective or emotional dimensions of learning and reflection than digital accessibility is. To the extent that digital accessibility is interested in these things, it wants to not make the cognitive load or the amount of information that a learner has to process more than necessary. And UDL, well, it's asking you to consider those, also recognizes that learning is inherently an emotional thing. So these things are not perfectly in alignment with one another. But I talk about them today in this way because I think it's important to understand that instruction that aligns with UDL often will take into account digital accessibility, and digital accessibility is being framed to take into account UDL, even if they aren't perfectly in alignment with one another. So understanding both those alignments and those tensions really can help you as you think about your instructional practice and design. So with that, I will say that brings me to the end of my section. I've given you some references, and there are also there's some additional information in the folder for you, and I will hand it over to Meredith. Stop sharing.
Thank you so very much, Carrie and Christina. Wonderful presentation so far. Thanks for also giving an introduction to the outreach side of things. I'm going to focus a little bit more on library instruction with UDL. So let me go ahead and pull up the slideshow. Hope everybody can see this okay. All right, so my name is Meredith Saba, and I am a current department head for Access, Research, and Instructional Services at Western Carolina University. And this is what my library looks like, the Hunter Library in Western Carolina. So we're not too far from Smoky Mountains National Park. Now, I've been here only about 9 months. So prior to this, I was at a different institution, and that's where the bulk of this particular presentation is going to talk about in that context. My research interests are information literacy, online course design, of which I've done quite a bit of, and accessibility. So mentioning that I was just at WCU for only about 9 months, up until last summer, I was at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. So that is quite a ways from here. And I was just talking with my colleagues here, with Christina and Carrie, about the fact that we have an international panel here, so to speak, with Carrie also in Canada, and then myself having worked abroad in Egypt for 5 years. So this is the AUC library where I worked, just a quick screenshot of that. And I was here as both a librarian and a departmental coordinator for several years. And I taught a course entitled LALT 1020, which is basically an acronym for Libraries and Learning Technologies. So this is a semester-long course. It's deeply embedded in the liberal arts curriculum at AUC, and it is a mandatory course that all first year students need to take before they can graduate. So this is a unique situation. I think everybody kind of aspires to a model like this, and I was very happy to step in and see that AUC had done this with the libraries really working with the curricular committee to embed the course into a student's degree. So we were instructors of record. All librarians are at AUC, we're faculty. And so we created a syllabus for this course, and we work with the registrar to register students in Banner for the course each semester, created, administered, graded final exams for multiple sections of this course. So we had about 700 students over the course of a semester. So we're talking about 21 sections with about 40 students each-ish. You'll see here on this schematic on the PowerPoint at the bottom of the pyramid, this is what you're looking at is the core curriculum for the liberal arts model. And in blue at the bottom in the lower left quadrant there is where you see Ret 1020, their rhetoric and composition course, taken in tandem with their LALT 1020 course. So students do register concurrently for these two courses in the same semester. And the skills they learn in our course, the IL skills, they translate directly into the RET course, into their final papers, as well as all of their other liberal arts courses. So this course has really evolved over the past 5 years in terms of modality changes, particularly during the pandemic. So originally LALT was taught face-to-face only, but then in March 2020, when everybody had to quickly transition online to courses in Blackboard or Canvas or Zoom, once everybody had acquired a license for Zoom, we had actually converted the course to a crude asynchronous version originally on Blackboard, which is the LMS at this university. And then we later, when we acquired Zoom, we created a much more robust synchronous version of this course that was basically all through the rest of 2020 and into early 21. Later, when students came back to campus, at least partially in person with vaccinations and whatnot in 21, we had a dual delivery version of this course, which is what you're seeing here in this screen. This was the setup for the hybrid version of this course in the classroom, where the instructor would teach half of the students in person at a physically distanced desks spaced out with a maximum of about 15 or 20 students there in person. And then the other group B, online, where you can see there's a screen in the back of the classroom for the instructor to communicate with the online students as well as the in-person and teach both groups simultaneously. So that was a very interesting learning for all of our librarians to teach both groups at the same time. Now, at the end of the 21 semester, when we started the DD course, I had conducted a survey with about 200 responses from students, just asking them about their overall preference for the online versus the face-to-face version of this course and which modality they preferred, what they would recommend for other students in the future. So these are the survey results, and this was really interesting to me, that most students actually ended up preferring an online course version versus the in-person experience for this course. And this really flip-flopped, because before the pandemic, everybody was like, oh, okay, I'm really scared to go online because I don't know what I'm getting into. When we transitioned, students were very anxious about it, but then they got more comfortable with it. And, with Cairo, you're talking about a very big city, lots of commuters. Actually, this is a commuter campus. So our students are, coming from long distances to campus, and many of them were actually preferring to take the course online by the end of this semester and saying, well, it really cuts down on the commute time, which could be over an hour, sometimes even 2 hours with traffic to campus for me, or, it just gives me more flexibility. And then the other thing is that we had growing numbers of students that were enrolling in this course over time, but we only had about 5 librarians who could actually teach this course on campus. So that's a lot of students for a lot of for very few librarians. So, we were also trying to figure out, what's going on with the university strategic plan. They wanted to globalize the campus a little bit more. That was part of an internationalization priority to offer more online courses in the future, to reach students globally from out of Egypt, students from the US, for example, who could take the courses online, or from Europe, or for other parts of the Middle East. So, at the behest of the provost, we actually began creating a more online asynchronous course. And this came partially out of the student survey results for a need for more online courses and that preference, as well as some students actually noted in the survey that they felt that the course should have an individual study version for students who wanted to do it at their own pace, at their own time, asynchronously, flexibly from any location, and so forth. So all of this combined really set us into an online self-paced course module design for the future. So as mentioned, we've been through many iterations of this course, from face-to-face to asynchronous, a very crude asynchronous version on Blackboard during the beginning of the pandemic, to a fully online synchronous Zoom with the instructor, to a hybrid dual delivery, and now we're looking at a self-paced version with modules online. So let me fast forward here to our modules. So we had about 6 modules that we started developing for this course. And the timeline for it, we created it starting in fall 2020. The goal was to finish by the end of the academic year so that we could start testing over the end of the spring into the summer of 23 with a student group, including students who had accessibility needs. So that's where we're jumping into the UDL with the course design for this particular version of LALT. And then once we tested it with everybody, with different types of students, different learners, we could debut it online in the fall of 23 with all the first year students coming in. So in building this course, we had to carefully consider all of our students and their needs, our users. And it's very interesting, actually, that at AUC, we have a very high amount compared to most universities, a very high amount of BVI students, what we call blind and visually impaired BVI students. And the reason that we had so many enrolling at our institution from that standpoint is because this particular university in Egypt had all kinds of adaptive technologies, an office of accessibility. We had programs for them. We had lots of support in general compared to other universities in Egypt. So we ended up getting, I would say, anywhere between 1 and 2 students on average per section across 21 sections of LALT that were considered blind and visually impaired students. We also had some students who were hard of hearing, deaf and hard of hearing. And then we had students who also had disclosed other disabilities. And we were, as instructors of record, we were notified by the Office of Accessibility and the Dean of Students Office whenever we would have a student who needed an accommodation for the class, and we would have to sign off on it and so forth. So in designing these modules, we really had to think about all the students that we had been teaching over the years in these different modalities, and the types of needs that we've encountered with them. So in many senses, going back to this UDL guidelines that has been shown already, in many senses, our librarians have been incorporating UDL principles into the teaching of this course in all formats, in the face-to-face, for example, even before the pandemic, simply because we have a pretty high, relatively high enrollment of students with accessibility needs at this campus. So when we were teaching this course face-to-face originally, we would, for example, make sure that when we were explaining our PowerPoints, when we were showing them on the screen in the classroom to the face-to-face students, that we were very intentional about making sure we described all the elements that were on the screen. So describing the image. If there was a video played, making sure that we described, after the video had played for a couple of minutes, describing what was in that video, recapping it a little bit, so that students who couldn't see the video or couldn't see the image on the screen could hear and visualize what that would look like, or what concepts we're getting across in their mind. We also made sure that we showed videos with closed captioning and, other types of alt text for metadata and alt text for the images on the screen. So, we had started this practice early on, but I think when we got into the online course development with the modules, that's where we really had to get a lot more creative with some of the things that we did to make sure that all of our learners were, equitably able to access and engage with the content. So now we had a lot of partnerships on campus with different units for our instruction, one of which was the Center for Learning and Teaching. They're housed in the library, so we were in very close contact with them for designing the online course for the self-paced modules. And they have incredible people there that are so talented with instructional design and best teaching practices and ways to assess students online in the digital format, creating an online course, making sure that students are able to learn equitably, that if there's any online learning cheating concerns or anything like that, that we took care of all of that in the grading model and made sure that things were equitably graded and so forth, with a percentage for each type of quiz and so forth. So they helped us with design strategies for all of the content that we created online for the course, for the online modules. So the videos that we developed, all of the quizzes, all of the practice activities for students in an online module environment, extremely helpful in that respect. So our design model, this is just a quick overview of it. Let's see, we started off here with learning outcomes. We actually had a backwards design with this particular course. We started off with the big picture and thinking about, the big ideas and what our overall learning outcomes were for this course over 15 weeks. And then we worked backwards into thinking about the types of assessments. What would the final exam look like? What would the quizzes look like leading up to, the learning outcomes that we want to achieve? The types of content that we want to develop along the way, and the practice activities, number 4 here. How do we design practice activities that prepare them then to take the quizzes and then the final exam later? The assessments they're graded on, the activities they weren't. So that was nice. They could easily practice and feel like, they're getting something in that tests their learning from the content that they've just seen in a video, for example, without feeling pressured like there's going to be a grade on it. So it gives them a chance to look at it before they actually, take the quiz, for example. So when we were creating these modules online, we also had to be very intentional about the accessibility standards and the UDL standards with designing not only the quizzes and the practice activities, but especially the teaching content. So when we wrote transcripts for each of the videos to narrate them, to record them in the studio, we had to make sure that we incorporated a lot of the principles from UDL, and we kept that, for example, in the form of captions and subtitles. We did this in a bilingual way because we had domestic students from Egypt who spoke native Arabic, as well as international students with the English language format. English is the medium of the institution, but since we had so many students from Egypt, we did want to make sure that we provided bilingual materials. So we did that in terms of captioning bilingually. We did that in terms of creating infographics and images that were bilingual with alt text descriptions as well. We also had PDFs and Word document alternatives from PDFs for different aspects of the course, such as, step-by-step guiding them through the research process, or for our services in the library, having a list of those or a chart of those. We wanted to make sure that there were Word document alternatives for a lot of these things, including infographics translated into Word documents, because that allows a student, for example, who is blind and visually impaired, when they're using the JAWS software on a laptop, they're able to then go through a Word document much easier and have it read out to them, rather than, worrying about trying to visualize it in another way. So it just makes it easier when they're using adaptive technology, when you convert some of these things to a word alternative. So I'm going to give you a quick look at, these are some screenshots of the course itself in Blackboard. So when we designed this course, we did a trial version of it, as mentioned, with students over the end of the spring semester 23 into the summer of 23, just to have them go through all the modules once they were created and put up on Blackboard. As you see here, this is the home page. But just to have them look at it and go through it and make sure that there was something, if there was something that wasn't accessible or they had a question about it, just, something that wasn't clear or wasn't designed well. So we ended up having a focus group of students during the end of that spring semester into summer, who did go through this whole thing. And we also had an intern working with the CLT who was hard of hearing. And we had another student who was a BVI student as part of that group too. So we had tested this with quite a few people. You can see here that there's a video example with a sort of a welcoming to the course. This is an overview of how the course is structured. This is what you can expect. This is how long each module should take, etc. And then I also introduced all the other instructors. So each librarian in this video is able to, you could see them visually. They would tell you which subject areas they cover as liaisons, for example, contact information. So there was always some sort of support built in everywhere throughout the modules to make sure that students, as they're going through the self-paced modules at their own time, their own flexibility on their own schedule, but that they also have a connection to the library and the librarians if they need additional help or clarification on something. Oh, let me go back 1 second and I'll just say, yes, for the videos, as mentioned, we had captioning in both English and Arabic at the bottom, subtitles. And we also had descriptions of the visuals. So as the visuals pop on the screen, the important thing is to make sure that they're described so that people who can't see this very well know what's on there. So just diving a little bit deeper as you go through, and you'll see on the far left side, there's a column in black that gives you an outline of all of the modules step by step from module 0, which is the getting started module, to module 5, which is the final exam module. And this is an overview of module 3. So this is just showing you an example. Once you click on one of the modules, you have an overview of the module. We did embed, I'm trying to recall the name of the technology, but we used a particular technology that we embedded into Blackboard that could actually tell you how accessible the content was as you go through it. So you can see it's kind of small here, but under the overview section, there's a little green button here. And so when we embedded this tool into Blackboard, I'll try and think of it and put it in the chat if I can think of it later. It's been over a year, so I'm trying to recall. But this tool was so helpful in gauging whether or not the PowerPoints that you put in here, the PDFs you put in here, the links, whatever it is, an infographic that you put in here is indeed accessible. And if it's green, it shows that it's very accessible by the standards of this tool. If it's yellow, it shows that it's medium. It's about, it's kind of so-so. And then if it's red, it's pretty inaccessible. So we felt like that was a really good way to look about this and in the design as we went through it before we even tested it with our students as well, to just confirm that. But yeah, you'll see here, there's an overview of the module. And then when you click on, each of these links, it expands, and then you'll see things like infographics and videos, the teaching content, the learning content in there. And you'll also see resources, PDFs and the Word document versions of those PDFs, or the Word document version of the infographic for students who are using adaptive technology. We also had links to the quizzes online, and if for some reason a student was struggling with the quizzes, we would make an appointment with them one-to-one, so they could come into the office and they could meet with a librarian who could help them through that quiz. Here's an example of an infographic. This is for our library services, and then for the resources and policies, we simply had links to external web pages. And then we also had a glossary of key terms for every module, because there's a lot of library jargon taught in information literacy courses. So just, what does it mean to have, what does open access mean, for example, or OER, so we had to define those terms while we were teaching the course over 15 weeks. And each module had that in both a PDF and a Word accessible version. So, going back to the UDL principles, so I've got a few minutes here, and just kind of recapping this whole thing, how we actually started recruiting interest. So the upper left quadrant, this was talked about by Christina earlier, the 7.1, optimizing individual choice and autonomy. And then 7.2 as well, optimizing relevance, value, and authenticity. So those 2 points, I think with the survey that we created at the end of the spring 21 semester with the dual delivery course, and getting that feedback about online interest over face-to-face interest for this course going forward, giving students that choice, that, that autonomy, that flexibility with a self-paced version as well, lent itself to this particular aspect of access and engagement. We also made sure that in the beginning module, the Getting Started module, that we really explained in the videos to our students why this course is relevant, why it has value, how does it tie into all of your other courses on campus, and what does that look like in tandem with your RET paper, for example. We also had, if you scroll down here to the next one, sustaining effort and persistence in the green category. Looking at the goals and objectives, that's really when you're defining your learning outcomes at the beginning of the course. What do you want the students to achieve through these modules? What should they know by the end of each module? You break it down even further, and then what the overarching goals are by the end of the course. Making sure that students, if you go to the purple category here, making sure there's different ways under perception here to offer different types of information in different formats, displaying it differently. So we did this by making sure that we had our lessons planned out in the video. We showed them in the video, we explained everything that was on the screen, but then the infographics that were embedded in Blackboard as images with alt text referred back to the video. So they were shown in the video up front and explained, and then the students had a visual static image to refer back to later with the alt text that, adaptive technology could read and interpret. So this comes hand in hand with offering alternatives for auditory information, visual information, having those subtitles, having them in different languages, scrolling down to the next point in purple here. So this is 2.1, 2.2, clarifying the vocabulary. So we did that with our glossaries for each module with the library terms, syntax and structure, any sort of text. We really wanted to make sure that these videos were short and to the point. So student attention spans can be, they can be quite distracted. So again, making sure to accommodate all types of students who have distraction problems as well, making sure that these videos were under 5 minutes each, and straight to the point, clear, concise language, making sure that again, the terms are defined and so forth, to ensure that students understood what we were talking about. That goes into comprehension, right? So highlighting the big ideas, looking at patterns and relationships. So every video tied to what was in the practice activity online, which also tied to the quiz at the end of the module. So everything was aligned and, you know, the concepts connected for them. So that was one of the things we really wanted to test over the summer with our students, who have accessibility needs and those without. So we tested with both groups, just to make sure the comprehension was there and that the concepts were flowing from piece to piece throughout each module. So I'm not going to go into every single one of these, but we really strive to, you know, make sure that the framework that was mentioned earlier, the multiple means of representation, having multiple means of expression, so providing alternatives for different types of students, making sure that they're engaged in every way by different types of content. So you've got the videos, but then they also have the hands-on practice activities in the online module that they can, you know, check whether or not their response is correct. And then there was feedback that would generate in the module that would say, you got this answer correct, and this is why, or you got this answer incorrect, and this is why. Go back and try again. So they were able to practice, and then after practicing the concepts learned from the videos, from the infographics, from the audio, they were able to then take the quizzes at the end of each module. And then ultimately this led up to a final exam at the end of the semester, in which we had students. This was actually the only in-person part of the course, aside from making appointments with librarians as needed in person. The only in-person component was the final exam at the end of the semester, where students would need to register for a particular room and a particular time slot at the end of the semester with given days that we offered the exam. And so they would report, you know, June 15th and say, okay, I'm ready to take the exam. And they would take it in person, proctored with a librarian, walking around the room to help anybody who needed help with technology or some other issue, making sure that nobody is cheating on the exam. That's another issue. So academic integrity was crucial in designing this course. So making sure they're engaged, making sure that they're learning, challenging them and motivating them to succeed. So with that, I'll end my talk. We're at 3:20, so I want to give time for Q&A for everybody in the panel. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you all so much. We have a few minutes left for Q&A. So if you participants, if you want to put your questions in either the chat or in the Q&A function. I'm just so many windows open right now. One question that came through that Carrie was able to answer is, what tools and software do you use to create these asynchronous tutorials? Because we're all looking for the good tools. She mentioned Articulate Rise, H5P, and Genially. So genial.ly. So those were some, which is a great question from makes my little instructional design heart happy. I guess I have a question for you all to just kind of get us started off, is how does one start? Like if you had to pick something, I know it's like a big question. If you had to pick one thing, one small thing that you would encourage folks to do to get started with enhancing their teaching practice through using universal design for learning, what would that be?
Well, my recommendation is always start slow and start small. It's going to fail beautifully if you try and do like 10 things at once. But what I think I started with was actually what we did for this presentation, which is creating a Google Drive folder where people can access different versions of anything that we're presenting. And that was the very first. And I think that aligns pretty well with multiple means of engagement, because that kind of came about because I hate writing down things by hand. And when at my previous job, when I was teaching info lit, I would ask people to handwrite on handouts. And, I couldn't read half the handwriting, and then realized, oh, I can't even read my own handwriting. Maybe we should provide digital copies too, and they could type if they felt like it. So that's where I started. And then, like I said earlier, it kind of just snowballed. But as we all kind of mentioned, it is very pick and choose. So I think the best advice is pick something that kind of speaks to you and that might work well with your workflow. Because if you try to pick something that either doesn't make sense to you yet or is the opposite of how you might do something, it's probably not going to work so well.
Yeah, I would say that for me, it really started with the students and seeing where the needs were, particularly with those BBI students that I mentioned, and exploring the technology that they were using, looking at the adaptive technology needs. So, I started looking at the JAWS software because a student came into the office and said, can you please help me do research on X and find information on Y? And so, I started looking at the program with him and seeing how does that technology work and what can we do to create mediums of presentation and assignments and, activities that were JAWS friendly, for example, adaptive technology friendly. So I started just exploring the technology on my own, looking at that with students. And just looking at the standards for accessibility, what was out there in terms of resources, hearing about UDL at conferences as well over the years has been really enlightening, and through webinars like this, where people can learn more about it, and take a look at how to incorporate those standards into how you're teaching intentionally with those students.
Yeah, my answer would be a combination of what Christina and Meredith have recommended, which is I would usually recommend starting with one format. And I usually recommend starting by testing it. Testing in some accessibility tools, testing with some students, and seeing how they engage with and perceive the instruction. And if you just pick sort of one thing that you use a lot in your instruction. So at my institution, when I came to this present role, we started with infographics because that was something that was really useful in online and in-person teaching contexts. And there was a lot of interest in producing, but that was someplace where we could place some emphasis and do some testing and start with just one thing. So that would be, you don't have to do infographics, but I would say start small by starting with just sort of one format. And that's pretty effective.
Yeah, and I'll just briefly comment, when I was giving my presentation and I mentioned I couldn't remember the name of that accessibility tool for Blackboard, it just dawned on me. It's Blackboard Ally. So some people have probably heard of that. Some others may not have, but it was a very useful tool in making sure the content in the LMS was, accessible.
All right, I'm gonna talk about a question we have in the Q&A, and then we have one more open question too that we're gonna direct at Meredith. So lots of tools questions about Canva instead of PowerPoint and how accessible Canva is. I'm gonna let Carrie and Christina answer it like they did in the Q&A. If either of you want to share what you had to say about that.
Yeah, so Canva used to be terrible with accessibility, and they've put a lot of effort and really improved their digital accessibility. Accessibility in slide decks, though, is really complicated, and that is something that is important for everyone to know, both from a UDL and digital accessibility standpoint, because slide decks don't have the same heading structure enforced as other things do. And reading order of the different elements on the slides is really important. And I bring that up because Canva still does the reading order of the elements on the slide based on when you added things to the slide, not based on the order in which somebody using an assistive technology would actually like to receive that information. And PowerPoint actually used to do that until maybe like a year ago. Like, it's been very recent that PowerPoint actually fixed that functionality. So if you're using an older slide deck that in your instruction that you're rehashing, you should check the reading order. It's probably wrong. I actually have a publication that I provided in my additional resources that I did with a colleague here and a colleague in the University of Michigan system, called More to Do Than Can Ever Be Done, looking at some of the issues around different instructional formats and their relationship to WCAG 2.1 standards. So I would refer you to some of the specifics that we called out in that publication. And Christina, take it away.
Yeah, I just echo everything you said, though I think you've done more testing with screen readers than I have. I love how pretty Canva is, and sometimes aesthetics get me over accessibility, so that's my super bad habit. But I do wonder if you download the Canva deck into a PowerPoint, what would happen?
So I can answer that. So the answer is you can actually go in and fix the reading order, and it will improve it. In the sense, if you go in and look at it, you can check the reading order. PowerPoint will try to fix it based on what it thinks you were trying to do. But what I found is that importing one from the other, it's not seamless. Like, there's some additional work that you have to do. What I find to be most helpful is usually if I'm using Canva, it's for some sort of graphical element. And so what I will typically do is do that graphic design in Canva, export the graphic, and then put that into PowerPoint and add the necessary alt text. And that is generally what I would recommend as the most successful approach. I've also been doing a lot of work with accessibility of slide decks, so I'm sorry, everyone. But as I said, we are getting ready for some really significant accessibility standards in Ontario. So all of the librarians at my institution have really been having to make some significant upgrades to our accessibility practices. And also, you know, this isn't just online learning. This is if you're using a slide deck in a classroom and you plan to share it through the learning management system, you have to ensure that you're aligning with UDL and digital accessibility practices. So, Meredith, I think there was a question for you.
We are over time, but I'm going to just let Meredith answer this super quick. How long did it take you to create all the modules, and how many folks were involved?
Yeah, so I'll be quick. So the dean and the provost had spoken with me about spearheading this project, but we had a bunch of librarians involved. I took input from everybody in the department on designing each module because everybody has different perspectives, concerns, ideas, etc. So we were all involved in the creation of it. But I was the lead designer on it in tandem with the Center for Learning and Teaching. The project took 12 months total. So fall of 22, all the way to implementation and debut online with the students in fall of 23. I hope that answers the question.
All right. Number of librarians, Meredith. Was it just?
Yes, our department, we had 5 of us teaching the LALT course for 700 students, multiple sections. So this was a big chunk of our job, this course. So yes, I solicited input from everybody in that department.
Well, thank you all so much for your wonderful contributions to this panel and for sharing your expertise with us today. If I can get a round of applause for our panelists, a virtual one if you want to use a reaction, or if you want to just write yay, thank you in the chat. We're getting some emojis and all kinds of fun things up. And I will just end it there. You should be getting a copy of the recording, as well as the folder with all the slide decks in it. So thank you all for today. You are wonderful. And I really appreciate you all taking your time today. So thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.